Welcome to the 2-minute warning interview series where we take a deep, if detailed, dive into the energy transition and what it means for the Middle East and beyond. We're delighted to have 𝗤𝗲𝘁, Head of Price Group at S&P Global Platts with us today. 𝗤𝗲𝘁, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Michelle. Pleasure to be here.
Let's start off with some broad strokes. It's a big question, so if we could narrow down a few key pointers, what can we expect from the energy transition in 2021? We've seen huge progress this year, an acceleration that has surprised many stakeholders, which is really ramping up concerns about stranded assets and other strategy conversions as well that perhaps were planned for the next 5 years have now been accelerated into 1 or 18 months. So how does that play out for us next year?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think coming into this year, we were already seeing a significant shift in focus, let's say, from many in the industry. We've, obviously in 2020, we've seen a lot of corporations come out with fairly aggressive new plans for how they are intending to implement the shift in energy infrastructure, particularly. And I think, next year is really the beginnings of some of the tests of that. And I think crucially as well, we're expecting to see what would have been viewed as kind of the future markets start to become the current markets. And what I mean by that is that very broadly, if we think through what is the energy transition, it's a shift in the overall global energy mix away from the traditional fuels and start to embrace other fuels and also markets like voluntary carbon, things like hydrogen, which, it's a fuel, but it's also an energy carrier. These are things which, in some cases, there's been some markets historically, but really we're starting to see those come through, more interest on them, possibly in many cases more trade, and therefore a lot more visibility. There's definitely an expectation, of course, that it's a real open question as to what does it mean in 2021 to be an energy transition when you're also, let's call it the tail end of the pandemic. I'm sure we all hope to see it, a shift in that sense. Because of course, I think going into 2020, one of the big areas that people were expecting to see a shift in was the start of an implementation of 𝗁𝗁 for the airlines. That's probably not such the same focus now as it would have been a year ago. We've all seen the rapid deployment of renewables around the world, and that's very much continuing, but it's maybe not such a new shift. I think really where we're going to see things is, okay, well, what does it mean to have benchmarks, pricing, trade in things like hydrogen, in things like carbon?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned hydrogen because you also mentioned the voluntary markets there. Again, that's a market that has been around. You touched on it, has been around, but perhaps now this year we'll start seeing a much more formalized scale up of it. It's been a formal market, and it's been implemented for well over a decade now, but it hasn't quite reached that mainstream area. And it's a similar story with hydrogen, though of course not as developed as voluntary markets, in that there have been quite a few false starts. And so is this the real dawn? Is this when hydrogen markets, amid this climate agenda and the political momentum we're seeing, is this when hydrogen markets really do stand on their feet and we start to see real progress to creating a roadmap in 2021?
I think we definitely see the market starting to ramp up. And as you say, look, hydrogen as a part of energy infrastructure has been there for a very long time. It's part of the whole refinery chain. But that's not what we're talking about here. Also, of course, we have seen pilot projects in some parts of the world, in Japan, in Korea, for a hydrogen infrastructure around transportation. What we've seen probably more of over the last few years in particular, and what we're seeing now, is investment in hydrogen as, we would describe it as a carrier of energy. There's a number of different technologies that feed into that. But in essence, you're taking a traditional source of energy, like, for example, natural gas, and converting that into hydrogen, or you're using excess power from the grid, from renewables particularly, to use electrolysis to generate hydrogen. And then in many cases, you may be looking at then dropping that into the natural gas networks, for which there's huge potential really for the use of hydrogen to decarbonize that network. Now, what's changed, and is this now a real dawn rather than a false dawn? I think if you look at the costings involved, there's been a start of a decline involved in that. We've started a year ago to publish prices for hydrogen that are built up off the cost of the technologies involved. There are a number of observers now saying, look, we're expecting the similar sort of trajectory on hydrogen costs as we've seen on, for example, solar over the last few decades, and what happens there. And I think there's also a recognition that, there is a very strong interest around the world in exploring every avenue for decarbonization, for meeting the targets that we're hearing a lot of coming through. And here is a technology that will help decarbonize things that, how else will you decarbonize a natural gas network? And it's an important part of how everything functions now. Michelle, we're having one of those moments where you are on mute, and I'm going to just...
Especially at the, sorry, John, especially at the scale required in terms of this decarbonisation. It's really a case of all tools in the box, and hydrogen very much seems to be that tool that can hit that key word, scalability, that is certainly doing the rounds.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the huge advantage of thinking of hydrogen as an energy carrier and a path to decarbonise natural gas networks is the infrastructure investments can be made nodally. You can say, okay, well, we can invest in a new plant that is, for example, near Rotterdam and well tied into existing energy networks. You don't need to think about, okay, well, how do we build a whole new energy network for hydrogen? That's not to say that there aren't those questions around hydrogen. There are, and particularly when you kind of consider the, how would you have a waterborne hydrogen network? How would that function? And a lot of people, the focus is on, okay, do you have a liquefied approach like we've had with natural gas, or do you look at actually kind of chemical changes and looking at, for example, ammonia? And those are all things that are being talked about that are highly likely to come through. But right now, you can build a plant and you can drop that fuel into the network. And that really is a considerably different proposition than, for example, saying, let's build out fuel cell infrastructure around transportation.
Especially in the economic environment at the moment, when the cost of the energy transition is around, well, by Wood Mackenzie estimated up to 40 trillion by 2050. We've obviously got lower oil prices. There's obviously the cost of COVID-19 to recover from as well, and the global retraction that we're going to see of about 6.5% according to the IMF. So against that picture, like you say, the idea of building a whole new energy system, and it would just flatten any momentum if that was the case. So this seems a much more accessible and viable route to be going. I just want to loop back to the assessing prices side of things. You just mentioned that Platts is assessing prices for hydrogen around the world and has been on and off over the last year. How does that work when there's no physical market trading?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we've started to kind of observe these markets closely over the last few years. And it was fairly clear, last year that, okay, we're not seeing spot physical trade in hydrogen yet. We're expecting that to come down. But benchmark pricing can be one of the unlocks around new markets and new infrastructure that really helps evolution. So we knew, and we certainly were hearing from a lot in the market, look, it'd be really helpful to have pricing in this space. We knew that the spot market wasn't there yet. So we've done this in a number of markets over the years, which is to say, okay, well, can we arrive at a value for this on a daily basis? We have a crack analytics team that does a lot of work in saying, okay, well, what are the factors that will be involved in a value of a commodity? And working with them, we arrived at an approach that took the inputs that are there, that took the analysis of the infrastructure that's there, and said, okay, what would be the cost for a typical hydrogen production plant on the basis of these different technologies, and therefore what would that say about the value of hydrogen in that area and using that technology. And what we've done is in the US, in Northwest Europe, and in Japan, we've pulled in our own natural gas prices, where we have those, or LNG in the case of Japan. We've pulled in the electricity prices, where those are kind of driving the costs there. Our knowledge of kind of typical plant operation costs, and then also considered, and this is where, you know, all these new worlds get somewhat complicated, because of course carbon is a core concern. So in some of these calculations, we're saying, well, what's the local cost of carbon? What's the cost of saving that carbon? What's the cost of sequestering it for some of them? And then you arrive at a range of different outcomes. Now, that's a value we're publishing. It's not a spot value. It is a simple, it's a demonstration that, look, if you're getting hydrogen from that source, that's one of the costs you would face.
You mentioned about hydrogen spots, and that would be coming at some point. When do you expect that we could see that? When do you think that will hit the market, be a viable route?
So, you know, it's going to be different around the world, but certainly within the next few years, within, you know, in the US and in Europe, we're expecting to see that. I think that if you look in Europe, and if you look at, for example, Port of Rotterdam, which is a core part of the energy networks anyway, conveniently situated at a kind of nexus between the oil markets, the gas markets, all these different things. That is, you know, a key place that we would expect to see spot trade fairly soon. And I think, you know, there's a bit of a debate as to, okay, is hydrogen simply going to be an add-on to natural gas net prices and markets, or is it going to be its own thing? Personally, it's going to be its own thing, in my view, because it's not just about natural gas. It's about tying in all these different markets together.
As part of that circular economy as well, that a lot of governments and broader are beginning to talk about. Hydrogen, again, just like we're talking about the scalability and the accessibility, fits into that circular economy argument quite naturally, really. On the carbon price, this is another conversation that's persisted for decades, but again, it seems to be ramping up again now. And we're back to that false awakening, real dawn scenario from 2020, which has raised a lot of questions about 2021. What's your take on the viability of a carbon price in the next few years? And could a roadmap be crafted in 2021? Could we start seeing real political, corporate, academic progress on this? Is that realistic?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think the carbon markets generally are fascinating, and that evolution that you referenced there over the last few decades, we've seen a lot of changes. You know, a lot of people, if you say the carbon price, they will think of the EU's emissions trading scheme, and they will say, well, look, there's a functioning market there. Indeed, there is, and it's a price, but it's a price that's it's Europe, and it shows you the price that someone is going to pay to be allowed to produce carbon. Similarly,
it's also had a lot of criticism, that price and that scheme. You know, it's not been a smooth road either.
Absolutely, it's not been. You know, that, and for example, California, North America, these are the compliance markets. These are the things where the government has topped down and said, look, you got to do it like this. Alongside that, we've seen evolve these voluntary markets around the world, where you can have a project, for example, in Brazil, to plant new forest or prevent forest being cut down. You can monitor that over time, and you can produce a credit. And the credit goes through a validation, a verification process, and it is then tradable. It's tradable, and who is trading it? Well, actually, we've seen a lot of corporates over the last few years embrace these markets because they've started to introduce and have carbon accounting alongside their bottom line accounting. And so these are markets that have really evolved alongside the corporate world. It's evolved alongside Wall Street. And as a result, it's a very different approach from a top-down approach. It's very granular as well. There's a lot of differences between these credits, between, you know, planting a forest in Brazil, or, you know, changing an industrial process in China, or, you know, building a renewables plant in India. And all of these things have different costs. What's changed in the last year is everyone started to realize, okay, fast forward 20 years or so, those are the markets that are really going to be defining the efforts to meet the Paris Agreement. And that has accelerated. We certainly see it accelerating next year. We think that the pricing within that is going to be essential. There's a lot of standardization that's happening now and conversations around that. Standardization is really helpful for markets, but it's not going to suddenly leapfrog and look exactly like, for example, a power market, or indeed like the EU emissions trading scheme. They're very different markets. They're quite complex, but I think because of the work of a number of different actors, what we're seeing is zeroing in on a very interesting and rapidly growing market over the next few years.
So on the pricing side, we're seeing a lot of evolution, hydrogen spot market potentially in the next few years. Major progress looks likely on the carbon price next year. Again, that is a conversation that's stretched for decades, and 2021 may finally be when it starts getting some real legs, aside from the voluntary side of things. So that's quite a bit of meat for next year already, especially on the regulatory side. If you had to boil down 3 points for 2021, what would be the 3 areas for the Middle East that you would expect progress on next year? What would be the main developments for 2021?
Well, I think we're going to see the energy companies in the Middle East embrace a perspective and an accounting that really takes into account environmental factors. Now, it's the beginnings of it. So it's, for example, of course, we saw blue ammonia being exported from Saudi Arabia going to Japan, a test case. The shift is, okay, you can see a few test cases, but really you need to say, how does this affect bottom line? So we will start to see that carbon accounting actually influence as well some of the analysis of the existing fossil fuel resources. And people are going to start to say, okay, well, what is the footprint of producing one crude versus another? Now, in the crude markets, we focus a lot on sulfur, we focus a lot on density. The hypothesis, and this is what's going to get tested next year, is that you're going to start focusing as well on the footprint of a given crude oil. This is something that, of course, Aramco has embraced quite significantly, and they sponsored a project by Stanford. So I think that's going to become a key focus. Now, will it become part of trade next year? I don't know, but I think it'll become part of the conversation around how we talk around crude oil and natural gas.
I think even having that carbon footprint about oil and LNG and natural gas, I mean, that's a huge step. That's massive in the global conversation, isn't it? And do you see that happening in the Middle East as a pioneer, as a forerunner, or do you see it happening in broader strokes and the Middle East adapting those lessons?
I think, look, the Middle East is a core of the world's energy markets, and it's a core of the world's transported energy markets, the waterborne aspect, and really that is the bit of the market that it defines value everywhere, because that's arbitrage. So the Middle East has to be at the core of this conversation and of these changes and developments. And I think we've already seen a lot of the national oil companies realize that and embrace it, but there's a big journey to go on. Alongside that, of course, you've got their own national challenges around, okay, well, where is it that renewables is going to take off? Where's the best investments on that? So I think there's going to be a lot of interest in being able to say, not just a blanket, we'll build more renewables, we'll build a carbon-free economy. But now people will start to dig in and say, okay, well, where's the best place to build a farm of this? Yeah, it's the execution phase, really. It's the start of the execution phase. The debates, I think, in many ways, everyone realizes, look, this is just part of how the world is going to be running for the next few decades. So now it's into, how do we do that? So yeah, hopefully that was 3 things. I think it was roughly.
Excellent. John T, thank you very much for joining us. Much appreciated. I think we've all got a lot to think about after that. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle.